marvel that this has gone the way it's gone. The circumstances of him getting hired there just are miraculous. I'm very thankful. If you have a Bible and you like following along in the reading, please turn in it to Colossians chapter 2. This is where we will spend our time. Just sang the song, once again, one of those times when I feel like, wow, we sing a certain song that fits within the sermon context so well, and yet Ed and I had no conversation prior, so I don't know how it worked out that way, but it did. Let's just pretend for a minute that we're sitting here. Now, I believe Jesus is here. I believe he's alive. I believe he's conscious of what we're saying, what we're doing. But let's pretend for a minute that he just physically walked in. Now, the first thing that would happen is I would sit down out there somewhere. That'd be the very first step for me. But then once I sit down, he looks at all of us and he asks us this question. He says, do you think the goal for your life is to surrender to me fully? Just like we just sang. And I'm just going to say, I know my answer would be yes, and I'm assuming everybody else's would too. But in that moment, now stop and consider this for a second. We're here, right? We're in the congregational setting. There is no way that that doesn't change the way we would think about that question if Jesus were to ask us that directly. It does change it. And here's what I mean. We are sitting here in the congregational moment, removed from the entanglements that all of us have in our lives. All of us. Yesterday was a case in point for Becky and me. We got entangled with our son in a way that we never predicted would happen. We're entangled in the care for our homes. We're entangled in care for our vehicles. We're entangled in care for other family members. We're entangled in care for our own bodies. We're entangled in care for insurance for our home. I mean, you go on and on and on and on and on. All of these entanglements. So the simplicity of what Jesus would ask us when we answer the question, yes, we do think the goal of our life is to be fully given over to you, surrendered to you, becomes very much more complicated when we start thinking about it away from these walls, I think, if we're honest. Think about it like this. And I think it's a beautiful picture, this picture of just simply following Jesus, as these hymns give us to think about it. I'm not saying anything against that. I believe that is the right way to think about it. But that's not the way the world looks to me. Not in my life, and I'm going to guess, and not in yours either. In Sifu, Japan, you probably don't know anything about this. I didn't know about it till I read about it. It's remarkable. Becky and I were driving over here this morning, and Becky says, oh, look at that. And what did we see but a cormorant sitting on a limb? Now, I don't know, you know what a cormorant is, right? We call them, people in the South call them a snake bird. It's a black bird, it's a water bird, and they swim to catch fish. They've got a really long neck. They swim at remarkable speed underwater. They chase fish down and eat them. And we saw one, and when you'll see them, usually what you'll see is a bird sitting on a limb near water with its wings stretched out, and it's just sitting there. It's drying out so that it can fly because it's been underwater fishing. Well, in Sifu, Japan, these fishermen train these birds from the time they're chicks. Generations of them have been trained so that they're a domesticated cormorant, and they use them to fish. And the way they do it is they tie a rope around their neck. Doesn't hurt them. These birds are trained this way. The rope is of a certain diameter around their neck. What the cormorant will do is go down and fish. The little fish that it catches, it eats. But the big ones are too big to go past the rope. And the cormorant master who works the lines brings that bird up, takes the fish out of its mouth and puts it back in the water and fishes. They will have upward of a dozen of these birds fishing off the side of the boat. That's a lot of lines. And the cormorant master's job is to keep those lines disentangled while the birds fish. So now think about that image and think about our lives with all of the entanglements we've got, and yet we want to be real followers of Jesus and we want to surrender to him fully. So think about that as we look at this text. I know it was a very long preamble, but Colossians chapter 2. I'll begin reading in verse 13. Paul says, we were dead in our trespasses and the uncircumcision of our flesh. Now you got to remember he's speaking here to a Gentile audience. So he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, wiping out the handwriting in ordinances which was against us. And he has taken it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. Having stripped the principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in his death and resurrection. Let no one therefore judge you, very important, in eating or drinking, or with respect to a feast day, a new moon, or a Sabbath, which are the shadow of things to come, but the body is Christ's. Let no one rob you of your prize by voluntary humility and the worshiping of angels, dwelling in things which they have not seen, and being vainly puffed up in their fleshly minds, not holding firmly to the head, from whom all the body, being supplied and knit together through the joints and ligaments, grows with God's growth. If you died with Christ from the elementary principles of this world, why then, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to such ordinances? Don't handle, don't taste, don't touch, all of which perish with use, according to the precepts and doctrines of people, which things indeed appear like wisdom, in self-imposed worship and humility and severity in treatment of the body, but they are of no value against the indulgences of the flesh. Now, there are probably 8 sermons in that little text, but we're just going to have one today. This is speaking to freedom. It's speaking that to tell you and me that when we find ourselves in groups of good-hearted believers, writing books, perhaps, or sending out sermons, perhaps, wherein they plant within us restrictions about how then we shall live, which don't have anything to do with the value of righteousness before God, which has been purchased for us on the cross already. That we need to be careful of that, because what we're getting are elementary principles. Now, in Paul's day, you had 2 groups of people, very difficult people for the church. One of them was the Judaizers. And most of the Judaizers were Pharisees that had become converted. And they felt very strongly that everybody who becomes a follower of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, should go through and live out all the kosher laws. That was the first problem they had. And this speaks to that. The second thing this speaks to, and if you go back and read chapters 1 and 2 together, which really should be done, he speaks to the Gnostics. They had a different point of view. Their point of view was Jesus in his material manhood was not the Messiah. The Christ is a kind of idea that God sends out from time to time onto the earth. And that this meant that the only thing that mattered in your life was your spiritual life. In other words, matter, the stuff that everything's made out of, doesn't matter for the Gnostic. What does that mean? It means you can do whatever you want with your body. Doesn't make any difference, because the only thing that matters is the spiritual life. So if you want to go to the temple of Aphrodite and enjoy the prostitution in there for an afternoon, no big deal. That's just your flesh. Your flesh doesn't mean anything. What matters is your spiritual life. So Paul is speaking against both of these in this text. But there's also a message for us. Now, in no way is Paul saying, don't worry about your behavior. Obviously not. I mean, what does he say to the church at Rome? Should we sin more that grace would increase? No. That's the dead flat answer. No. So here we are. Jesus, this text tells us that in Jesus we are dead to these things. That tells me that it's not just an outward edict that controls my behavior anymore. There's something inside me that controls my behavior. I've been changed in what I want to do. So have you. So has anybody who comes to Jesus for salvation. The Spirit of God comes in. We're changed in what we want to do. And over time, a lifetime, we become changed more and more and more into His image. The Gnostics, though, were enslaved to the passions of their bodies because they felt like they could do whatever they wanted. They were enslaved to them. The beauty of the gospel of Jesus is that the passions of our bodies have their proper use once we're surrendered to Him. So we're not talking just about behavior here. But the key to this whole passage, in my view, is verse 23, where he talks about the elementary principles of the world. Is all right behavior that we would engender, that we would go out and try to live well, an elementary principle? No. The Bible, Paul's writings are full of things that he tells us, don't do these things. They're not godly practice. But the piece we miss as Gentiles is that the whole of Christianity is rooted in Judaism. I've said this, and I could be wrong about this, but this is the way it looks to me. Since we are grafted in, according to Paul, into the olive tree, which is Judaism, Israel, we as wild branches grafted in now have become, in my view, completed Jews in a sense. We're part of that family of God that the Jews are part of. And when a Jew becomes completed, they become part of that same olive tree. Not grafted in, but original branches. So this idea of having Christianity rooted in Judaism, every Jew I've ever read who got converted, what did they say? They said, I read the New Testament, realized I was reading a Jewish document. So they recognize it. Salvation is from the Jews. What was the Jewish goal in life? It was shalom. Now, shalom, we just think peace. It's much bigger than that. Judaism and Christianity are the most materialistic understandings of spiritual life that are on the earth. Why is that? Because everything matters. Matter matters in Judaism and Christianity. And so, shalom had to do with your flocks, with your relationship with your spouse, with the health of your children, with the health of your business, with your health, with your outlook on life, with your spiritual life with God, all bunched together in what was known as shalom. It's a very big word. It carries a lot of connotations that we don't think about when we think about our life with the Lord necessarily. Well, there are snares for us as followers of Jesus in this, where Paul is talking about the simplicity of following Jesus, just like we just sang in that last hymn. That simplicity can be so upset by some of these snares. And one of the elements of the snares is contained within congregational life. I know that sounds strange, but it's the truth. Why is that? It's just like being in a family. You start to know each other far better than you know people perhaps outside these walls, as we would refer to it as a church family, right? So once that closeness starts to become part of our normative thinking, we start to see stuff in each other. Now that's not bad. I think that's part of what the community of believers is for, the body is for. Body life is to help us live this life of being a follower of Jesus. So if you see something in me that needs to be corrected, you're obligated to say something to me. Obligated, not just, it's just like if you had a child or an uncle or a sibling and you see something in them that you know is destructive for them, we as family members are then obligated to say something about that. But there's a problem with that. Once we know stuff about people, we start comparing a little bit. Now you get into a congregation that's not this congregation, because this congregation, I must say, is not like that. Where everybody's an activist here. I don't see any, I'll just say it for what it is. There's no dead wood in here. There isn't. We're too small for that. You get in a larger congregation, what happens? Well, we become, in some sense, this closeness becomes a tool for the enemy. Somebody's really busy in the church, and they look over there at somebody else and say, they don't do anything. And pretty soon those comparisons start to happen, and the simplicity of being what God said of Abraham. What did God say of Abraham? He was his friend. Abraham just believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So when that relationship gets disrupted by these congregational moments or these interpersonal things, the ritualized particulars of being a follower of Jesus in a congregational life start to become the whole thing. And pretty soon, we exact burdens upon other people. We feel burdens exacted upon ourselves that we were never, ever meant to bear. Never. And what happens to the church? What happens to Christianity? What happens to our life with Jesus? Jesus becomes a coach. He becomes a coach. Pretty soon, he's like the coach. I remember when I played baseball when I was in school, and I used to hate the coach. I did, because what would happen? You get out on a hot day in May or June here in the South, and he says, 20 wind sprints from that pole to this pole. Man, when I got to the 20th, I just stopped. I mean, I'm done here. I'm not going to do anything extra for you. Well, that's exactly what happens to us when the elementary principles take over. Jesus becomes a kind of a coach, and we're no longer walking with him in a loving relationship of friendship. We're walking with him as a coach. He becomes a master beyond the fact of who he really is, and we start to resent it. Now, if you don't think that's true, I've been there. I've been there. When I was in Pennsylvania, I was traveling with the band upward of 200 days a year. I was preaching, and I was an elder, which meant I got to do all kinds of other stuff too. And there came a point in my life where I started to resent it. Jesus started to become a coach for me, not my friend with whom I walked because I loved him. Those are elementary principles. Paul says in Romans that Jesus justifies the ungodly. What does that mean? It means the bad people go to heaven. That's exactly what it means. The ungodly. They're the ones that go to heaven. You know, one of the things when I talk to people online, atheists, you're just trying to earn, we talk about whatever it is, giving or some charity or some work that's being done. You're just trying to earn your way into heaven. I'm a bad person. I'm going to heaven because Jesus died for me. That's what's happening, really. So let me paint this picture for you, this contrast for you for just a moment. And this will make a ton of sense, I think. It made sense to me, so I hope it'll make sense to everybody else. Let's say you've got a non-believing couple with young children, 3 and 4 and 5 years old. A couple of little children. They've never been to church. They were both raised in families that never went to church. They're not believers. Their parents weren't believers. The little children aren't believers. Nobody's a believer. Everybody's completely divorced from anything that has to do with congregational life. Well, they just suddenly decide one Sunday, you know what? We've got some friends who go to church all the time. Let's go to church. And they go. They go through the service. They get in there. They're greeted. They sit down. They get sent, the adults get sent to their Sunday school. The children get sent to their Sunday school. There they are. They're attending the Sunday school. In the Sunday school for the children, they get a lesson on 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4, where they learn some things about how we should live as Christians. But then the teacher happens to notice something about these children. They've never been to church. This is a nice church. This is a big church. This is a wealthy church. Their friends are upper middle class friends. They're upper middle class, but they go to the church dressed very casually. The little children are in flip-flops and t-shirts with some kind of animal on the shirt, you know, a bear or something like that. And the teacher happens to notice that all of the other students who know how to be in church, they're wearing their dresses and their little button-downs. And she says, we dress better than that in God's house. Now, you don't think that happens? I guarantee you it happens. It happened to me. It's happened to friends of mine. I know it happens. What has happened now? The elementary principles have been applied to these children. And you better believe they'll remember it. And the parents will remember it too when they find out this happened to their children when they get home. Is it likely that those parents will ever go back to church where they might hear the gospel? Not very. Because of what? Because of the elementary principles. The elementary principles that don't have anything to do with godliness. This happened to me directly once. We were traveling, and we had to go somewhere where there were 2 or 3 cars. In other words, I was driving the equipment truck, somebody was riding with me, but there wasn't enough room for everything we had to carry for this particular concert series, And so there were 2 cars with us, so we had 3 vehicles going. Now, people who know me well, my wife being one of them, knows that once I get on the highway, whatever those numbers are on that sign, the cruise control gets locked on those numbers. Now, you may think, well, Rip's just funny like that. Well, maybe so, but it's something I've done since I was 17. When I was 17, I did it for convenience. I don't want to be bothered driving along looking every way to see if there's a cop that's going to radar me and pull me over. I just didn't want to be bothered. And I thought 55, when I was first started driving, 55 was the national speed limit. Good enough. I'll go 55. Well, then once I became a Christian, I had a sticker on the back window of my Rabbit that said, Jesus lives. And I thought, now if somebody comes up behind me on I-75 and I'm going 80 and they're going 82, and they read that sticker and they think, yeah, Jesus lives all right. Look how fast you're going. So it became a matter of conviction for me, and still is to this day. I don't care what you think about it. It's just me. That's me. You've probably got things that I might violate that you feel very strongly about, so don't take too much of this and think too much of it. We got to the concert, and I drove the speed limit. Well, everybody got there before I did, and it was an hour trip. They got there like 3 minutes ahead, but they were furious with me. Why? What are you doing? We need all the time we can get to get the equipment set up. I said, I just drove the speed limit. And nobody wanted to hear it. Okay, what happened in that moment? The elementary principles became my burden because I drove the speed limit. I couldn't just simply live before God driving the speed limit as I felt convicted to do. And I passed the elementary principles to them because I laid a burden on them that they didn't feel, which is drive the speed limit always. And now we've become at odds, almost enemies, over something that's nothing but an elementary principle. Paul says this to Timothy in Ephesus. He says, I was a blasphemer, I was a persecutor, and I was insolent. He says, but then I obtained mercy. That's the only standard there is for anybody in this room. That's the only standard for anybody who becomes a follower of Jesus. We obtain mercy. Paul says to the church at Rome for the commandments, you'll not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. Whatever other commandments there are summed up in this saying, love doesn't harm a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Anything we add to that as some kind of restriction on somebody's life as a follower of Jesus will rob them of their freedom in the Lord to simply live before Him as they feel called. Everybody in this room, all of us, are making all kinds of mistakes as followers of Jesus. We're all falling short. Can't even count the ways. Fell short probably between the time I walked from that door to this one this morning. But either the blood that was shed for us was sufficient to cover that, or it was not. Paul thinks it is. I'm with Paul. I don't know where everybody else is in this room, but if anybody wants to speak with me after the service, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.